No one paid much attention to Elias Crowley. He wasn't the sort of man who raised a fuss. He never showed up at town meetings, never lodged a complaint, never raised his voice. To the newer residents of Willow Glen, he was that old man who lived just past the tree line on the southeast ridge, the one with the dusty green truck and the bent straw hat. He had white whiskers, leathery skin, and a back that still stood straighter than most men half his age. He looked like someone carved out of the past and left behind. Some whispered he was a veteran. Others said he used to be a prospector, and a few believed he simply wandered onto the land in the 70s and never left. Only a handful knew the truth. Elias Crowley had once been one of the best surveyors in the state of Virginia, but he didn't offer that story unless you asked, and most people didn't. His land, sprawling, serene, and untouched, lay like a forgotten Eden, hidden beneath a green veil of pine, hickory, and cedar. It bordered the ever-expanding suburb of Willow Glen, where progress marched like a drumbeat. Every year, new houses popped up like dandelions. Roads that once ended in gravel now extended as pristine, asphalt lined with painted crosswalks and LED-lit street signs. Willow Glen was becoming a planner's paradise and a developer's gold mine. That is, except for one conspicuous holdout, Elias Crowley's under 20-acre plot of land that wrapped around the southern edge of town like a protective arm. Developers hated that land, not because it wasn't perfect for building, it was. Flat enough for efficient grading, close enough to highways for easy commuting, and tucked away just enough to give the illusion of privacy. But Elias would not budge. Over the years, various investment groups had tried every strategy in the book. Some sent smooth-talking men in pressed suits. Others tried young, eager women with glossy pamphlets promising community, gardens, and eco-conscious design. One even tried buying off the local planning commission to pressure a rezoning. But that backfired spectacularly when Elias showed up to the hearing with a decades-old land use agreement, signed by his late father and notarized with state seals. He said little during that meeting. He only had to speak once, and the room fell silent. The phrase he used was remembered long after, "This land is spoken for." After that, most gave up. They figured Elias was either senile or simply content to die on that land with his principles intact. The town grew around him like ivy around a post. But one group didn't see it that way. One group believed they'd found a loophole. The Silver Pines Homeowners Association was not just a neighborhood group, it was a machine. Backed by the real estate conglomerate Penbridge Holdings, the HOA had ambitions. They were known for taking on challenging parcels, navigating municipal bureaucracy like seasoned lobbyists, and flipping raw land into master-planned communities in under 2 years. When their scouts stumbled across a curious discrepancy in the county records, a blurred line in a plat map dating back to 1949, they saw opportunity. According to a secondary survey filed during a township merger in the late 70s, a 96-acre swath of Elias's land might not actually belong to him. It had been marked as public resource property by a now-defunct zoning committee. The platting had never been officially rescinded, and the original documentation was unclear. Penbridge smelled blood in the water, and Silver Pines, eager to deliver another sparkling neighborhood, pounced. Elias received no letter. No warning, no knock at his door. One morning, as he was filling a bucket at his well pump, the rumble of engines drifted up from the tree line. He walked to the edge of the field and squinted. Bulldozers. They came with flags, ribbon markers, and armed with clipboards. A mobile trailer popped up. Fencing appeared overnight. Survey markers dotted the woods like mushrooms. They cut down trees, carved new roads, and poured concrete. It was as if an invading army had landed. Elias, hands in his pockets, stood at the tree line and watched. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply turned around and walked back to his house. The next morning, he made coffee and read the paper like he always did. His old border collie, Sadie, lay curled near the hearth, unbothered. To an outsider, it would seem as though the old man either hadn't noticed or didn't care. But inside that quiet mind, wheels turned. Elias Crowley hadn't spent 40 years studying land for nothing. What the developers didn't know was that Elias had been maintaining exacting records since he inherited the land from his father in 1982. Every 5 years, he resurveyed it himself. He updated his deeds with GPS coordinates as technology improved. He even cross-referenced satellite imagery. Elias didn't trust computers with the full picture, so he kept paper copies, meticulously drawn plats, elevation charts, hydrology logs, and property filings. He knew his land better than anyone. He could walk it blindfolded. 2 days after the bulldozers arrived, Elias drove into town not to complain but to pull records. He visited the county clerk's office, the zoning department, and the archives division. In the planning office, he waited silently while a 20-something intern awkwardly fetched dusty boxes filled with blueprints and microfiche reels. He made no comment when he saw the outdated plat map with the 96-acre misclassification. Instead, he asked for copies. Then he drove 3 hours north to Richmond, where the state's Department of Natural Resources had a vault of archived land use filings. What he found there made him smile. Penbridge Holdings had overlooked one thing. The 96-acre parcel in question had already been reclassified. In 1998, when the township standardized its GS systems, Elias had signed that document himself, alongside a zoning officer who'd long since retired. That document, signed, stamped, and filed, officially reaffirmed Elias's full ownership. But due to a clerical error at the county level, the update hadn't made it into the public plat maps. The developers had pulled the wrong version. They had built their empire on a ghost, but Elias wasn't finished. On the drive home, he stopped by an old friend, Martha Jensen, a retired environmental lawyer. They shared coffee on her porch while Elias laid out everything. She read the documents, laughed, and said, "Elias, you've got them by the throat." "Not yet," he said, sipping slowly. "But they're walking into the trap." Back on his land, construction continued. Framing crews nailed up plywood walls. Cement trucks hummed. Realtors began talking in town about Silver Pines, the future of Willow Glen. Young couples started reserving lots. Model homes were framed within 6 weeks. A grand opening was scheduled. Still, Elias said nothing. But behind the scenes, he moved like a shadow. He filed for certified confirmation of property lines with the State Survey Board. He filed a quiet title action to reaffirm ownership of the disputed acres, attaching decades of evidence. He looped in Martha to prepare a conservation easement on the full 120 acres, a legal mechanism that would render the land permanently protected from any residential or commercial development. He made copies, stored some in a safety deposit box, mailed others to trusted friends. Every legal trap was set, one carefully placed spike at a time. 3 months later, the first home in Silver Pines was sold, and the first domino was ready to fall. Still, Elias did nothing publicly. He mowed his lawn. He split firewood. He took long walks with Sadie near the creek where they'd once found deer tracks in the snow. He passed by the edge of the new road, watched families tour the model homes, and tipped his hat. Occasionally, a realtor would wave at him, likely thinking he was the eccentric local neighbor. They had no idea. In town, people began whispering again. "Isn't that Crowley land?" One man asked at the feed store. "I thought that was his," said the librarian. Did he finally sell? But Elias hadn't sold. He had simply waited. By the end of the year, 38 homes were built. 12 were occupied. The HOA had bylaws drafted, fees collected, and landscaping contracts signed. A clubhouse was nearly complete. The local paper ran a feature on Silver Pines, calling it a triumph of efficient growth. When asked to comment, Elias Crowley declined. But in his barn that night, under a single flickering light bulb, he unrolled the newest survey map, freshly stamped by the state. Across the center, in thick black ink, the words were written, "Crowley property, full title, 120 acres. Elias smiled. The bulldozers had rumbled through his trees. Concrete had been poured. Streets had been named. But none of them had checked the foundation. Beneath it all, the legal bedrock of land ownership. They assumed the old man didn't have the strength or the knowledge to fight. They assumed wrong. And now? Now they had built 96 homes, right into his trap. Elias Crowley stood at the edge of his land, the autumn wind brushing his face with the scent of sawdust and fresh paint. The Silver Pines subdivision had grown like a weed in fast forward. What had once been the soft rustle of leaves and the quiet hum of crickets was now replaced by the shriek of power saws, the thud of nail guns, and the whir of cement mixers. They built like they were racing a storm. 96 homes in various stages of completion. curving streets with cookie-cutter names, like Bluebird Lane and Whispering, Hollow Drive. Streetlights flickered on at night now, artificial and bright, lighting up what used to be a haven for deer and owls. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't grieve the loss, not yet, because he knew something they didn't. The developers had planted their community in stolen soil. Every morning he kept his routine: black coffee, a few slow laps around the property with Sadie, his aging border collie, and a quiet check of his files. The barn had become a war room. On one wall he had tacked up photocopies of deeds, surveyor stamps, historic plat overlays, and a meticulous calendar tracking the HOA's construction timeline. He had a legal pad with notes from conversations, some transcribed from memory, others recorded with a dusty voice recorder he kept in his truck. It was all part of the process. Elias didn't plan to throw a punch until it would land hardest. He watched as Silver Pines installed signage, polished brass lettering on a faux stone wall, a tasteful little fountain trickling beside it. A community of families, the sign read. Beneath it, fresh sod and seasonal flowers. Elias nearly chuckled. They were laying roots into land that didn't belong to them. It was as if a family had moved into your house while you were away and started repainting the walls, never realizing you still held the deed in your coat pocket. More homes filled with people, young couples mostly, pushing strollers, walking golden retrievers. They waved to each other, to the landscapers, even to Elias himself when they saw him on the ridge with Sadie. Some had no idea he was the rightful owner of the land under their feet. Others, vaguely aware, probably assumed he was just the old guy who lived on the fringe of civilization. Nobody asked. Nobody came knocking. In their minds, this was progress. This was suburbia blooming. Inside their glossy welcome packets, the HOA provided maps, rules, bylaws, and contact numbers. Nothing about disputed property, nothing about Elias. In fact, Silver Pines boasted in their marketing material that all land was clear and verified. That word, verified, stuck with Elias. He circled it in red ink when he saw it on a flyer someone had left at the local diner. He underlined it twice. They weren't just careless. They were arrogant. One rainy afternoon, Elias stood on the southern edge of the subdivision and watched them dig for a community pool. Men in slickers worked a backhoe, carving out what had once been a fertile stretch of soil where his grandfather had grown tobacco in the early 1900s. As the earth churned and machines clawed deeper, Elias looked on with an expression that was almost fond, not of what they were building, but of what they were erasing. History, memory, and now consequence. That night, he mailed out the first of a dozen certified letters. They weren't sent to residents, not yet. They went to Penbridge Holdings, the developers who had funded the project. They went to the local planning board, to the zoning officer, to the attorney listed in Silver Pines as articles of incorporation. Inside each envelope was a clear, precise legal notice, a statement of ownership, accompanied by survey data, copies of the 1998 reclassification, and a notification that all ongoing development on the 96 acres constituted unlawful encroachment. He gave them 30 days to respond. They didn't. Penbridge Holdings, bloated, with arrogance and shielded by their high rise office in Richmond, dismissed the letter as a bluff. Internally, they circulated emails describing Elias as a local crank with a stack of dusty maps, and assured their legal team that all paperwork was in order. The zoning board didn't reply, not directly, but Elias heard through an old contact that his notice had caused a mild panic. They thought it was a stall tactic, that he wanted a payoff. They expected negotiation. Elias didn't want money. He wanted his land back. With the letters ignored, he moved to phase 2. He hired a surveyor, an independent one, with a sterling reputation and zero ties to the region. The man, a meticulous professional from out of state, took GPS-tagged measurements of the property lines, using both modern tech and old-school transit levels. He produced a full report confirming the original boundaries. Everything Silver Pines had built, everything they had paved and landscaped and sold, sat squarely inside Elias Crowley's legal property lines. The next step was timing. Elias didn't want to rush. He wanted their roots to dig in deeper. He wanted their signs posted, their documents filed, their families moved in. The deeper they dug, the harder the fall. He knew from decades in land disputes that the more infrastructure a violator builds on stolen property, the more damaging the legal blow would be, and the more sympathetic the court would be to him. So he waited. He watched Silver Pines host their first block party. He saw the bunting strung between porch railings, the chalk drawings on driveways, the kids in Halloween costumes giggling up and down Acorn Street. His heart did not harden. He didn't blame the families. He blamed the machine behind it all, the developers who hadn't done their homework, the HOA board who believed their influence granted them dominion, and the legal sharks who assumed an old man with a long memory would just fade away. As winter settled in and the final homes were framed, Elias met again with Martha Jensen, his retired legal friend, over coffee and molasses cookies in her kitchen. "They've got 78 homes fully built now," he told her. "And 17 sold, 5 pending. The rest staged." Martha leaned back, assessing him over the rim of her mug. "You ready?" "Soon, after the new year." She smiled. "They'll never see it coming." "I hope they do," Elias said, "right before it hits." By February, the roads had been named. The street signs bolted into the ground, and the HOA had formally established its governing board. They hosted their first community meeting in the new clubhouse. Elias, ever patient, pulled the minutes from the county website. He read them while feeding the fireplace. The HOA was planning a second phase, an expansion of 30 more homes, just south of the current build. Elias smirked. They were walking straight into the furnace. He spent the next few weeks preparing the next round of filings. A formal ejectment petition was drafted with the help of Martha and a younger attorney. She recommended. It was a rarely used, but powerful legal instrument that allowed a landowner to reclaim property from unlawful occupants. It wasn't an eviction. It was more like resetting the game board, legally pushing trespassers back across the line. The petition included not just survey evidence, but aerial drone footage, development timelines, legal affidavits from old neighbors, and most damning of all, a signed copy of the 1998 township reclassification, with both Elias's and a zoning official's signatures clearly visible. It was bulletproof. He filed the petition quietly. No press, no warning. But once it landed, it hit like a hammer. Within 72 hours, the Silver Pines HOA board received official court notification. Residents were not informed, yet. The developers, now neck-deep in another project 2 counties over, were blindsided. Penbridge scrambled to contact their legal team. The documents were dense, ironclad, and devastating. There was no easy out. They couldn't produce a single document that nullified the 1998 plat revision. The best they had was a copy of the outdated zoning map and a flimsy title search that hadn't included archived state filings. Elias had them. Calls started trickling in, first to his lawyer, then to his home. One came from a frantic HOA board member asking for a meeting. Elias declined. Another came from a lawyer offering to settle the matter amicably. Elias declined again. He didn't want their money. He wanted the land cleared. By April, the story had leaked. A local news station picked it up, framing it as landowner battles developers over 96-acre subdivision. The online version of the article had a picture of Elias standing next to his barn in denim overalls, arms crossed, a quiet fire behind his eyes. The reporter had tried to paint him as cantankerous, but the comment section turned fast. People called him a hero, a patriot, David against Goliath. Residents of Silver Pines began to panic. Some had moved in only weeks prior. Others were finalizing mortgages. Real estate agents went silent. Title insurers pulled out. The HOA sent out mass emails assuring everyone the situation was being resolved, but it wasn't. The court date was set for June. As spring painted the fields green again, Elias spent his mornings on the porch with Sadie, sipping coffee and watching robins flit through the pines. He knew the hardest part was coming, not the court, but the reaction. Not everyone would see the justice. Some would see only disruption. Innocent families were involved now, victims of the same arrogance that had ignored Elias's ownership. But Elias wasn't the villain. He hadn't struck first. They had. One evening, as he walked the old trail down past the creek, he passed the edge of the subdivision. A young father was setting up a basketball hoop in his driveway. Their eyes met. The man gave a short nod. Elias returned it. They were both caught in a game someone else had rigged. Elias kept walking, the sun setting low, golden light stretching across the trees. He had protected his land. Soon, the law would enforce that protection. And when it did, the illusion of silver pines would begin to crack. The homes had sprouted like weeds, but the soil knew the truth. And justice, like spring, was inevitable. Chapter 3. The Crack in the Foundation. The first true crack in the Silver Pines facade came not from a judge's gavel, but from the whispering voices of unease that began to ripple through the community. Like a slow-forming fracture in glass, invisible at first glance but deadly in its depth. It began with rumors, hushed conversations during HOA board meetings, sideways glances exchanged at mailbox clusters, and strained smiles at the neighborhood park. Word of Elias Crowley's petition had traveled faster than even the developers anticipated, faster, certainly, than they were prepared to confront. At first, the HOA dismissed the panic. Legal posturing, they said. Miscommunication. But panic is a peculiar contagion. It doesn't need facts to spread, only doubt. And Elias, quiet and steady as he had always been, had planted that doubt with surgical precision. What unnerved the HOA the most wasn't that Elias had filed a suit. It was that he had done so with such calm, cold confidence. He wasn't a man flailing for attention or trying to squeeze a settlement. He had proof and he had patience. He didn't just want an apology or a check. He wanted the land and he wanted them off it. Within a week of the news breaking, a ripple effect began that no one could stop. The title company servicing Silver Pines halted all pending transactions, leaving 6 families stranded in escrow limbo. 2 buyers backed out entirely, forfeiting deposits. A third family, who had moved in only 10 days, earlier broke their lease and vanished overnight. Their blinds still open and a pink, plastic tricycle sitting abandoned in the driveway. Real estate agents suddenly went silent when asked about Silver Pines listings, diverting conversations, making vague excuses, or directing interest elsewhere. The subdivision, once hailed as the crown jewel of Willow Glen, began to rot from within, the gleam of its new paint unable to mask the rot that had settled beneath its foundation. Elias observed it all from a distance, never smug, never cruel, but with a gaze sharpened by the quiet fury of a man who had waited too long to see justice done. Every call from the HOA's legal team, every email, every offer to negotiate, was met with the same answer. Elias would meet them in court. Behind the scenes, the HOA scrambled. They attempted to retroactively validate their claim to the land, hiring new surveyors, digging into township archives, trying to construct a narrative that would refute Elias's crystal-clear documentation. But every attempt met a wall. The 1998 reclassification had gone unnoticed for one reason only: the developers had skipped a thorough title search. They had relied on assumptions, on speed, on old zoning maps that no longer held legal authority. They had built fast and marketed faster. And in their haste to lay concrete and sign mortgages, they had bulldozed over the single most important piece of paperwork, the plat deed that Elias had preserved like a sacred relic. The judge presiding over the preliminary hearing was stern and humorless, and after reviewing the petition, he allowed the case to proceed with a preliminary injunction: no further construction, no new home sales, and no expansion of infrastructure would be allowed on the disputed land until the final ruling. That single stroke of the gavel rippled through Silver Pines like an earthquake. Work stopped overnight. The second phase of development, slated to include a new cul-de-sac and a community garden, was halted. Mid-dig, contractors were sent home. Equipment sat idle in the mud. The freshly poured concrete sidewalks, some not even cured, now served only as a cruel reminder that progress had been built on borrowed ground. Residents who had once boasted of their up-and-coming neighborhood began to reconsider. Home values plummeted. Property insurers, upon learning of the ongoing dispute, began sending notices of non-renewal. The community clubhouse, barely a month old, hosted an emergency HOA meeting that drew a record attendance but no answers. The board, now under siege, could offer little more than reassurance and promises to explore all legal options. But the truth was simple and stark. They had been duped by their own ambition, and Elias Crowley had caught them with their boots sunk deep in stolen soil. One of the more vocal board members, a retired accountant named Marvin Doolin, attempted to paint Elias as a villain. In a newsletter hastily printed and hand-delivered to each home, Marvin called Elias an opportunist and a selfish obstructionist standing in the way of community progress. The piece was riddled with errors, speculation, and legally dubious statements. Elias didn't reply. He didn't have to. Within days, Marvin received a cease and desist letter from Elias's lawyer, citing defamation. Marvin went quiet. The board began to fracture. Some members argued they should settle, offer Elias a massive payout, fundraised from HOA dues and emergency assessments. Others insisted they fight, terrified of the legal precedent a win for Elias might set. After all, if one man could reclaim nearly 100 acres of developed land, what was stopping others? Meanwhile, Elias prepared. He hired a firm to scan, digitize, and archive every relevant piece of documentation from the past 50 years. He tracked down retired township clerks, surveyors, even a land commissioner from the 1980s, who remembered the zoning debates that led to the reclassification. Each became a potential witness. He consulted with land use experts, recorded video logs of the property, and kept copies stored in secure locations. Elias was not a man of half measures. If they intended to challenge him, they would face the full weight of his truth. And the residents? Some began to reach out, quietly, carefully. One sent a letter, handwritten, apologizing for their ignorance and asking if Elias would ever consider selling, or at least letting them lease the land formally. Another, a single mother whose home sat closest to Elias's ridgeline, left a basket of cookies on his porch with no note, only a small card that read, "We didn't know." Elias read every word. He didn't hate the families. He pitied them. They had been swept up in something far bigger than their white fences and weekend barbecues. They were pawns in a game orchestrated by developers, who now pretended they hadn't cheated at all. Still, he couldn't spare them. Not yet. Not until the land was his again in the eyes of the law. One evening, as the sun set behind the silhouette of silver pines, Elias stood on his porch, looking out over the rows of houses, the shadows stretching long and solemn across trimmed lawns and driveways. He thought of his grandfather, of the oak tree that used to stand where a garage now rose, of the quiet dignity of stewardship that had passed from generation to generation. This land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was memory, legacy, and it had been stolen not with violence but with arrogance. The trial date loomed. Inside the courthouse, rows of pew-like benches filled with residents, reporters, and attorneys. The judge, the same no-nonsense man from the injunction hearing, oversaw proceedings with a stern efficiency. Elias's lawyer presented their case methodically, historical surveys, aerial imagery, testimony from a retired land assessor, and the clinching document, the 1998 reclassification order, signed and certified. Penbridge's team attempted to muddy the waters, but their arguments were weak. Their defense boiled down to, "We didn't know," which the judge reminded them was not a legal defense against trespass. The HOA's attorney, red-faced and defensive, argued that dismantling a neighborhood would cause irreparable harm to dozens of families. Elias's lawyer replied simply, "So does building on land you don't own." As the trial stretched over days, media attention swelled. News vans parked outside the courthouse. Headlines swirled, "Land war in Willow Glen," and "The subdivision that shouldn't exist." Interviews aired with legal experts, who unanimously agreed Elias had the upper hand. Still, the judge reserved his ruling. He wanted time, he said, to weigh the social implications, the economic cost, and the legal precedent. But Elias knew. He had seen the faces of the jury. He had seen the way even the judge glanced at the map overlays, brows furrowed with the kind of incredulous sympathy that came only when the truth could no longer be ignored. Outside the courthouse, Elias was approached by a young father from Silver Pines. "Mr. Crowley," the man said, nervously wringing his hands, I don't blame you. I just want to know, what happens to us if you win?" Elias looked at him. The man was earnest, his eyes tired, a child's crayon drawing sticking out from the folder he carried. "I don't know," Elias said honestly. "That's for the courts. But I didn't take anything from you." "They did." The man nodded slowly, thanked him, and walked away. The night before the ruling, Elias sat by the fire. The old map spread out before him like a battlefield. Sadie rested her head on his boot. He thought about compromise, about forgiveness. But the echo of bulldozers in his memory hardened his resolve. They had erased his land with steel and profit. He would restore it with ink and truth. And when morning came, the judgment would come with it. The morning air was dense with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the sort that hangs heavy before a storm, taut with the weight of what's about to be unspoken no longer. And as Elias Crowley walked up the courthouse steps, his every step measured and unhurried, he could feel the gravity that had settled over Willow Glen, pressing down like humidity, thick with tension and the unspoken prayers of 96 homeowners, clinging to hope that their lives wouldn't be uprooted by the truth they had chosen not to see. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restrained energy. Journalists whispered into microphones, legal clerks shuffled papers, and residents in their best pressed clothes filled the pews like parishioners awaiting sermon. But it was Elias, calm and solitary, who commanded the unspoken center of the room, sitting without legal entourage or grand gestures, just the same man who had once walked those hills alone with a compass in hand and an old dog by his side. When the judge finally entered, all rose, and the creak of wood and leather echoed like cannon fire in the tension. And then, with a gavel's crack, the words that followed would alter the fate of everyone in that room. Judge Halverson, austere in demeanor and methodical in word, took no pleasure in the verdict he was about to read, for the facts were not in dispute, but the implications were vast. Yet justice, he reminded the court, was not swayed by inconvenience, and so he laid out the timeline as though marking coordinates on a map. The reclassification of the acreage. In 1998, the surveyor records properly filed and never refuted. The continued taxes paid by Mr. Crowley and the deliberate negligence by Penbridge, development in the Silver Pines HOA, in failing to perform a complete title investigation prior to construction. He paused, looking over his glasses at the sea of drawn faces before him, and then delivered the decision with the finality of a stone dropping into still water. The 96 homes in question had indeed been built on land that did not legally belong to the HOA or the developer, but to Elias Crowley, and therefore constituted unlawful occupation and trespass. The room erupted, not with applause or chaos, but with a collective exhalation of dread, as if the very oxygen had been replaced with disbelief. One woman sobbed openly. A man cursed under his breath. Others simply sat in stunned silence as the judge continued, detailing that while the court would not issue an immediate eviction or demolition order, the ownership of the land now reverted officially and uncontested to Elias Crowley, and it was within his legal right to seek damages, lease terms, or removal of all structures should he so choose. The neighborhood bore a quiet humility now, a reverence for the land that had once been ignored. People planted trees native to the region instead of imported shrubs. The community garden, once a vanity project, became a real place of cooperation, tended by children and seniors alike. The clubhouse, previously reserved for private parties and policy debates, was transformed into a local history archive, where the original maps, photos, and even an audio interview with Elias Crowley were preserved under glass. The town council, stung by its own inaction, passed ordinances strengthening land, registry verification, and mandating full public disclosures for all future developments. Elias, for his part, remained mostly in the background, maintaining his modest cabin, walking the land at dawn, and keeping careful watch, not out of bitterness, but duty, like a farmer watching the tree line after wolves had passed. People began to see him differently, not as a recluse or a grudge holder, but as a sentinel who had reminded them at great personal cost that land is not merely space to be filled, but heritage to be honored. Then came the spring thunderstorm, the one that tore through Willow Glen like a warning shot, flattening fences and uprooting weak trees. And as neighbors huddled in their homes, bracing against the wind, a bolt of lightning struck near Elias's cabin, splitting a dead pine in two and starting a small fire that consumed part of his back shed. The next morning, as the sun rose over steam-covered fields, the people of Silver Pines emerged, not to check their own gutters or photograph the debris for insurance, but to walk together up the ridge to Elias's home. Dozens came, some with buckets, others with tools, all with the shared instinct of reparation. They helped him rebuild the shed. They repaired the singed edge of his fence. One man planted a new tree. A girl brought a drawing of the cabin framed in oak. Elias said little, but he stood straighter than he had in years. And when the work was done and the people began to drift back down the hill, someone turned and said, "We owe you more than this, Mr. Crowley." He nodded once. "Just don't forget," he said quietly, and turned back toward the horizon. Years later, a plaque was placed at the edge of Silver Pines, where the development's stone sign once stood, and it read, "Here stood a neighborhood born in arrogance, redeemed by truth and made whole by the man who would not be moved." Children asked who Elias Crowley was, and their parents would tell them about the man who taught the town the meaning of land, of law, and of legacy, not with lawsuits and fury, but with patience, clarity, and a trap so simple no one saw it until it had already closed. A deed kept safe, a surveyor's eye unclouded, and a faith that truth, buried though it may be, would always rise again like grass after fire. And when Elias passed, quietly in his sleep on a late autumn evening with Sadie by his feet, and the wind brushing the curtains like a whisper of thanks, the town held a memorial at the clubhouse, not one of pomp but of memory. They told stories. They walked the land, and in the quiet just before dusk, they rang a bell fashioned from the steel of the old bulldozer that once tore into Elias's ridge, one single note echoing into the hills, where the oak trees now stood tall once more.